Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. My name is Jeremy, and I'm your host. And this is a podcast where we just want to ask the questions that we think that you would ask as it relates to Sunday's message. And as we do so, we hope that it helps you grow in your life and your faith. With that being said, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of the podcasts that are coming out. Not only that, hit the like button, because when you do so, it helps us help other people. And if you ever have a question about Sunday's content or about Overtime, you can submit those to overtime@npaustin.com, and we will be sure to get to those in future podcasts. So with that being said, here's a quick recap of Sunday, and then we're going to jump into our conversation today.
And so the question that I really want to address in part 3 of this series is, how do we keep winning our sales consistently over time? And so what I want to share is actually an equation. So there's really 3 parts that we need to be aware of. And the first is very simply limited time. I think this principle is so clear in Psalm 90. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Teach us to number our days, that we might gain a heart of wisdom. The second part of this is to recognize that there is some kind of divine calling. For example, I think about what Paul wrote to a young Timothy. For God saved us and called us to live a holy life. That was his plan from before the beginning of time, to show us his grace through Christ Jesus. And then the third piece on that is just the simple acknowledgement that there is ongoing opposition. Jesus says, you will have trouble in this world, but take heart because I've overcome the world. Are you aware that the time is limited, so you can't do everything? Are you aware that you've been called to something significant? And are you aware that there are things actively opposing that?
All right, so Jordan, you talked about a lot of life happening on Sunday, and just a couple of small things been hitting you in a very short amount of time. And you talked about your house, talked about Buck got COVID, you jumped on, took 2 messages last minute. And just for context, Buck is very much so doing great. And we were in a meeting with him today, and seems to have some life in him, seems to be doing just fine. So he'll be back up on Sunday, which is good. But give us an update. How's life going? Do you have some wind in your sails since Sunday? What's the latest?
Yeah, that's a good question. See, I've beyond just this last month, I always have a hard time answering that, because I'm like, it seems like there's always some things that are really good and some things that are hard, and that's like a life thing, right? So, yeah, I mean, I had, even a couple more like fun things pop up, over the weekend that I shared with you, and I was like, oh my gosh. So to some degree, it's like the hits keep coming. And then also I took some time at the beginning of the week, went to the pool, saw some Northpoint people at the pool, so that was fun. Just happened to be there.
Yeah, and is this your pool? Is this
nope. Nope, I'm sneaky.
Yeah. Well, what's funny is I had a I don't know if it's good to share or not. I had a conversation with one of our friends who lives in your old neighborhood, and they commented at seeing you at the pool, and I was like, he doesn't live here anymore. Yeah.
No, it was good. But see, that's real. I love to just read and relax, and I go places by myself. I like to go to movies by myself. Yep. I like to and then when I see somebody that I know, it makes it a little awkward when I'm somewhere solo, but I'm like, I really enjoy it. I don't know. We have a job where we interact with so many people. I love to.
Nice to recharge on your own.
So,
I still think the movie
but
is weird.
You think the movie thing is weird? Do you see movies by yourself?
I have. It's a little less accessible for me now with baby, because my days off, it's kind of I want to help Ash and stuff. And there's a restful component of just being with family, but it's definitely not as physical in terms of rest. But yeah, I have in the past. It's been, and if I get an opportunity either to drag Ashley to a movie with me, she and I've understood this. It took me a minute, but she doesn't like to see movies during the day because you come out pretty tired. Yeah. And it's all of a sudden it's bright all of a sudden, Yeah. And we went and saw a movie. We saw Top Gun recently.
Oh yeah.
Which was fantastic.
Yeah.
But I remember walking out just oh my gosh, I'm exhausted now, and it was 1 p.m.
Right. Yeah.
So I have seen movies by myself in the past, but not as much lately.
Yeah. I don't know, man. I've always loved it. I saw a movie with Matt a week or 2 ago, and I said 5 words to Matt. We didn't even talk to each other. We didn't even hang out. I'm like, I could have just gone solo.
Well, I've learned not to go see movies with you. So you walk out 5ve minutes in.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah,
You're the only person I've ever done that to. I've never left anybody else in the middle of a movie. It's just
I don't know that for sure, but
had a work call. I had to go.
Yeah, that was good, fun. Man.
So, so I don't know. I don't even think I answered your question, but yeah, they're working at actually tearing up our floor right now. So just starting with the bathroom. Don't know if it'll be the whole house or not, but have Mowgli here with me as a result. So he's not there with, people tearing up our house.
Yep.
So
Yep.
gets to join the podcast for the first time.
Nice.
But
Nice.
yeah.
Well, cool, man. Well, I hope some days back rested and just life winding your sails. Hopefully you're getting a little bit back.
Yeah.
I did want to talk about the formula you kind of broke down through your message on Sunday, because I thought it was just a great, super practical, super helpful thing that we all need. And, that is the idea that, like, what you talked about, like, winding your sails is not a sustained thing. Like, it comes and goes. And so how do we structure our life in such a way? Now, there's a lot of variables that are not within our control, but how do we structure our life in such a way that we are in a posture to sustain kind of wind in our sails and hope and looking forward to the future on a regular basis? Mm-hmm. And so can you just recap the formula really quick and what that looks like? And then we're going to break down each part just super practically.
Yeah, well, it's funny because speaking of Matt, he came up to me after service and he's like, dude, you gave me PTSD because I remember when I was a student and you listened to that podcast and then you made the whole student leader retreat just about that podcast, and he was like, so for whatever reason, it just, when I first heard the formula, it just hit me. And I don't know, I think maybe you probably don't have to live a whole lot of life, but you live a little more life and you've had enough things that you try to fix or try to address or try to give, sustained energy to over time. And then it takes a back seat and you're like, God, how do I stick, with all of these things? How do I keep, multiple things important in my life at a time and give them, good energy within reason and so on. And so whenever I heard this from Craig Rochelle, it just was impactful to me. And like I said, I renamed it Sustained Wind in Your Sails. It was sustained urgency. So how do you have, sustained momentum or energy or an intentionality in any area of your life? And I think it's applicable to business and leadership. I think it's just as applicable to your personal life. And the three pieces were, 1, limited time, 2, divine calling, and 3, he says outside opposition. I said ongoing opposition because I think some of that, opposition can be internal as well. But, so limited time, just that feeling, which of course isn't true for any of us, but that feeling like I can do it tomorrow or get to it tomorrow ends up being a huge enemy of progress. And I love, he actually challenged you to write down something that you've been wanting to do for a long time. And he's like, either decide to do it in the next 2 months or just say, I'm never going to get to it, which is just kind of this interesting, make the decision or make the call. But I love it. And it's true. He, kind of talks about any story that has that limited time aspect to it. I was thinking about, have you ever seen the movie Cellular? Do you know what that one is? I don't think so, no. And then it's not going to be helpful. A guy picks up he gets a phone call from this woman. She had been kidnapped and she puts wires together and it calls a random number. And it's I think it's Chris Evans. I think it's
okay.
Not Captain America. I think
Captain
America. But he gets a phone call and he can't hang up
because she was the bad guy in the movie.
Oh yeah, he's taking on more bad guy roles.
Yeah,
too,
yeah.
But
anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So he's she's got an hour. He's got to go find her and he can't hang up because she might not be able to call him back because she just tapped wires. And those movies are super intense the whole time.
Yeah.
But it's we have to apply those things to our stories to be there has to be a sense of urgency. And then divine calling is the why behind anything. If you don't know your why, you're not going to be able to sustain pursuing it over the long run. And so remembering your why or defining your why, either way, a lot of that time, in anything to go get remotivated in business or a relationship is oftentimes just take some time away even and remember your why. And then ongoing opposition is just that realization, which we're usually most aware of, at least the external opposition, but anything that keeps us, from doing that. So it could be limited resources. It could be competition. It could be a crying child that is the outside opposition to your peace and sleep. There's plenty of things that keep us from, but it's the recognition that when all those three are lined up and you have a conscious awareness of each of them, it's going to lead to some urgency. And sometimes it's that urgency, intentionality, momentum that leads to feeling wind in our sails over time. Part of the problem, with the series is what we want usually is to feel wind in our sails first, and then we'll go do something different. And it always works the opposite. It always is we have to change something first, and then we experience the wind in our sails. So,
yep, for sure. It's interesting too, because limited time and ongoing opposition are both more realities to remind ourselves of versus divine calling is something to discover.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's when we take a piece out of the formula, we kind of get wind knocked out of our sails, or we get out of balance in a way when we aren't aren't recognizing we have limited time in the world, then we aren't prioritizing the right things. We're not recognizing, how to spend our time in a healthy and intentional way. When we're not paying attention to the opposition, we're not paying, when we're maybe not being honest with ourselves about what's getting in the way of, what we're ultimately called towards or what our dreams are, something like that. So it is really important that, we recognize those things and also, lean into our divine calling. So what I want to do is kind of break down each of these and just for the sake of our time today, just really talk about practically, and you talked about some of this on Sunday, but I want to break it down a little further. Just practically, what are ways in which you, and I'll make comments on it myself, and then we've heard of other people just living these things out, these 3 different parts of this formula. So the first one is just practically, how can we remind ourselves or have a perspective that we have limited time?
Yeah, well, I think it would have to be specific to the area to some degree, right? Like I think, like the finances example I gave is like one of the clearest to me to be like, there's always this kind of like, countdown with any financial planner. It's going to help you. There's a countdown to specific dates. And a lot of times there are very specific goals with that. It doesn't even just have to be retirement, but kids' college or, any of these things. My car is going to break down eventually. And so I need to, have a plan for what the next car is and so on. Yeah. So it, those areas are very, straightforward if you have a time where you're consistently checking in on your finances at whatever regular interval that is for you, or so on. I have some fun with it. Like I mentioned the app. I think it's a free one that I was talking about. And I think there's a lot of apps that do this. This one's called Day Count. But I have like some of them on there, right? So it's like apparently 18,015 days until I'm 78 and a half years old, until December 1st, 2071. Wow. And that's the average age, the American. I may die in a car accident this afternoon. I don't know. But if I make it to the average, that's how much time I have left. Yep. 13,084 days.
That is such a quickly, you're one of those guys that just... I know, yeah, but I know you do such a good job of reminding me and the people around here, like, hey, heaven's around the corner.
Yes,
and so yeah.
I feel like maybe this setting is more appropriate, but I had to like scale back my excitement around some of these topics because I recognize that based on where somebody is at, what they're going through, to be like jovial about death can be, just very narrow-minded, very, what's the word I'm looking for when you're not like considering the opposite of empathy? Inconsiderate. Yeah, thank you. I'm a little tired, sorry. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so I don't want to, like when people are going through, really hard things of life, you don't want to joke about it at a large scale, but on a personal level, there's this like excitement to me that to know that our life doesn't go on forever because of what's next, like specifically because of heaven. I tell people I'm scared of like how I will die or the unexpectedness. I'm scared of a lot more scared of people around me dying. Something happened to Emily or something. I mean, I would never be the same. But in terms of my personal, I'm like, it's that like, sorry, I feel like Josh wants to say something about your voice there.
It happens often.
But anyways, I won't dive too much into that. But yes, so there's an excitement around it. And then I have till my 30th birthday. I don't know why that's the other one I have in there. 300 days today. Yeah. 300 days.
I'm halfway to 30. I don't know if you knew that. This is an inside joke in that when I turned 25, I told Jordan I was halfway to 30. Yeah. And what I meant was from 20 to 30. But he was like, "Oh, you're 15. That's film school teaches you good math, huh?"
Like, hey, bro. Yeah, like that doesn't doesn't work out. So.
Yeah, I think that's great. I would also just comment on, in terms of how we can remind ourselves of limited time. I think even just some statements or, we've talked about personal declarations before, and just having some statements that remind us like, hey, today is, a blip on the radar of eternity. Mm-hmm. And so, one of the things I've said is heaven is just around the corner. That's like been in my, one of my personal declarations is like, at the end of it, it's like, and all of this is true. And then heaven is just around the corner. Yeah. One of our good friends, Wes Young, he has this statement that he says all the time and he actually gave me this hourglass that has his quote on it. And I thought the hourglass was great because it it's just a representation of time. And he just says, we all run out of time and money before we run out of ideas and opportunities to spend it. Yeah. And it's just so true.
Yep. 100%. 100%. I was thinking there's another practical, it takes a degree of self-awareness, but I think there are so many moments that pop up in life that give us the opportunity to consider either our own, morbidity or like our, whatever clock is ticking down, and we tend to try to ignore them. I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're really small and they're really big. I was standing next to you in the production booth the other day when I got the ESPN alert that Bill Russell had just passed away. And I was like, man, for any kind of like big sports fan or NBA fan, that's one of those moments to be like, oh my gosh, he's a legend and he's not here anymore.
Yep.
And I think it provides some of those moments and opportunities to like, man, that actually is sad. And, you kind of reflect. And sometimes, it is a celebrity. Kobe Bryant is a moment that like counselors were meeting with clients about because it was like such a big cultural moment for people,
Yeah.
And I think there's things like that all the time. I do think birthdays, like the fact that we keep track of age is probably good for that reason.
Yeah.
And we're like, I don't want to think about it. And I don't want to celebrate my birthday. And, there's like these, because there's this realization that we're getting older. Our kids are going to another grade. I don't want to think about them older. No, think about them older. You know what I mean? Like if we sit in some of those moments of discomfort, if we have conversations with people about like where we're really at and light of where we wanted to be, I do think life presents a lot of those like reminders that are good opportunities for us. So.
Yeah. From a 28-year-old and a 29-year-old sitting here, we can say in our experience that time brings a lot of perspective. Yeah. And, that's a very limited experience I feel like we have, but it is so true though.
Yep.
We've seen it on the other side of people. We've heard it on the other side of, people with more life experience who have come through Northpoint, and we've gotten to learn from them and hear from them. Their regrets, that their mistakes and the things that they felt like they did well. And it's super helpful to pay attention to those things.
Yep.
So the next one I want to look at, and I think as we were talking, I noticed that this kind of goes in order. Like you need to like recognize your limited time so that you can begin to unpack what your divine calling is. Yeah. Right. And so like that recognition of limited time is like, oh, I don't have all the time in the world, so I need to make sure I spend it on the important things in life. You know,
it's like a midlife crisis, right? It's what spurs you into some like, where am I at in life questions? The recognition that my time is running out. You know? Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. And I want to be careful here because what can sometimes happen, and that's where that word divine is so important there, because if you just said limited time plus calling, I can go like, a midlife crisis, my calling, I need a boat, and a boat is not bad, but you get what I'm saying. Like, people hit the midlife crisis and they're like, oh no, I haven't lived it up enough. But
fair point.
But when you choose to follow Jesus, what you're saying is like, hey, there's actually a divine component of what I'm called to in this life, and Jesus defines what those divine things are in a lot of ways. Not both broadly, and then I think in specific relationships with Him, specific to each person as well. And so let's talk about divine calling. What does it look like to discover divine calling? How would you kind of break that down?
Yeah. So I said like, what's hard for me is. Almost my immediate answer is there's like this conforming aspect that is not exciting to people, that I'm like, we just have some of these very clear mandates of what it looks like to follow Christ. And sometimes we want it to be so unique or so special or so, clear, and God comes down in a burning bush and tells us, but like we just have, I was almost talked about it Sunday, but I'm like, man, it feels like every other sermon we could just say, love God, love people. But like, there's this very clear, like greatest commandment, so there's this mandate that, whatever that specifically looks like played out for us to love God with all our heart, all our soul, all our mind, and to, love our neighbor as ourselves. Like, okay, what does that like look like for me now is a great next step to that, but that's a clear calling, divine calling on all followers of Christ, you know? So there are going to be plenty of things like that. And then I said it was, specific. If you are a husband, if you're a wife, if you're a father or mother, like now we have, great mandates. I think about like Ephesians 5 as that gets like very practical in terms of what each of those are. And so each of those are in there as well. I get that people are talking a little bit more specifically probably about like a career path or me or my contribution to the world and so on. And that I think of Proverbs, I believe it's 27:2. I had it up here. Yeah, Proverbs 27:2 says, let someone else praise you, not your own mouth, a stranger, not your own lips. And I think that makes me think of American Idol, at least back in the day. They're so much nicer now, but back in the day, like young Simon Cowell, pre-kids and everything, clearly some people thought they could sing that could not sing, right? We're not always the greatest at recognizing our own gifts, talents, contributions to the world. And similarly, our insecurities, you have plenty of people walk on that show that are unbelievable and they had no idea. Their friends made them, their mom signed them up, and they're like incredible. And you're like, oh my gosh, why aren't you using this gift for the world? So there's a certain degree that with a body of work over time, enough people reflect to you a certain gifting, a certain talent. You're so good in these situations, these types of conversations. You're so good at, this empathetic side of you, or using your voice, or you have this leadership, or you have whatever. Versus like if you just decide in a silo on your own, I want to go be a leader, and you want it for like all the wrong, reasons, and you want to be known or famous, but nobody's ever really reflected like, hey,
right.
you're leading people, to something good here. So I do think there's like that awareness of, trusted people, kind of trusted advisors, not people who just puff you up, but that will point out to you, hey, I think this is a gift or a contribution that you can have to the world, is kind of in that practical list after you kind of have faithful, your immediate family relationships, loving God, loving people, as we get down to that, I think that might be, push you on a path there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I would just go back up to the thing that's more universal to all of us, and kind of combine two concepts: the what Jesus gives us, what Scripture gives us in terms of what our priorities are in life. And like you talked about yours, faithful, and then you said husband, and then you said father would be there if you had kids, and then pastor in Austin would be one specific to you, right?
Yep.
And I think Michael Hyatt has a great resource called Living Forward. It's a book, and I want to be careful with it because I have a tendency to like go all in on these things and go into a coffee shop for an hour and plan my life and then walk out and be like, here it is, I'm ready. You know what I mean? And I think God just chuckles when I do that, and so if you're more type A, my personality type, and you're listening, you probably, have that kind of tendency as well.
Yeah.
And so all of these, like everything in moderation, take it with a grain of salt, but Living Forward is cool. It's a cool book because it has you kind of view your life as a bank account. And it's a great analogy because he says your bank account always has a limited amount of money to spend, and you choose what things you're going to spend it on. And so going so much so with this limited time and divine calling idea, we all have kind of these life accounts in which we can take the life we have and invest it in specific areas. And so what Michael Hyatt has you do is like pick your life accounts essentially. And mine would be similar to yours in that, I think mine kind of go a little very similar but different, but like, relationship with God, number one, being faithful is like my number one goal. And then I just recognize that I can't give what I don't have to my family, to Grayson, to people I lead. And so I put, what's weird and maybe selfish is I put myself at number two to make sure I'm prioritizing my own health. And then, husband and dad. And what's crazy is then like work is like number 5 on the list, and that's a humbling thing to like, come to those conclusions. But looking at how, that's how I break it down. He says, don't have more than like 8.
Yeah.
And so you get to work, and then you get to like friends and family, and then you get to like play time. I don't know, whatever else it might be. And then it's like, you don't have much left to give, and that's a good recognition to come to. And so that's a great resource. I think if somebody's going like, how can I break this down and begin to think, Living Forward by Michael Hyatt. Again, super self-helpy, but in a lot of good ways, I would say too,
Yep. I love it.
And then I would just say the question I've heard Andy Stanley say time and time again when somebody's going like, what was I made to do? God, what did God made me to do? Is just asking and answering the question, what breaks your heart? And most of the time, intuitively, there's something that breaks your heart.
Yes.
And you can oftentimes align, loving God and loving people with that thing that breaks your heart.
Yep.
And perhaps that's what God has uniquely called you to do.
Yeah. And he's giving you that story that led to that, specific area where you get to make this contribution to the world as you like follow that. I think leaning into that too. You and I were talking about that a little bit ahead of time. Like, obviously I've shared with you more than most people, but I mean, I've joked about it on stage too, half seriously, of my own insecurities and insecurity around public speaking. And, that is so many people's greatest fear. It's a great fear of mine too. And there's this weird balance, between like, okay, there's a good staying rooted in humility in that and so on. But over time, like this is something I've been doing for 12 years now, when enough people reflect like, hey, that's some type of gifting God has given you, right? And so whether that's a room of like, 100 people or 1,000 people or whatever, to almost like neglect it and be like this scared little kid that's like, no, I suck and everybody's going to hate me. It's like, it's robbing of the opportunity. It's like God gave me that gift not to say like, oh, so that Jordan could be great or have more Instagram followers or something. It's like he gave it to point people to Jesus, and I'm robbing of an opportunity to do that if out of my own fear and insecurity, I don't lean into that and develop it and be faithful with with it and so on, right?
Yep.
And I was telling you, like, even to phrase it that way, it's weird because it feels like an arrogance or something. Like it feels like, but at some point there has to be like, man, enough people have reflected this to you. The scriptures are so clear. Like we talked about it, Peter, he's given each of us a gift. Like, okay, you've got to go like discover what that is. And for the kingdom, like for people to love God, love others, like go hone that and utilize that. And that's part of being, faithful. So whatever that, means. But
yeah, I would just say on that note too, like, when you answer the question, what breaks your heart, most of the time you're not saying, I break my heart. You're not saying myself. Like most of the time, divine calling means like elevating, loving the status of the people around you in some significant way or some specific group of people, and that requires a certain amount of humility. That is not, I just read a quote from Brendan Manning this week, and he has a book called Ruthless Trust. And he says this so well, and this is really hard for me to stomach right now, but he says, following Jesus, the humble in heart waste little time in overt introspection, navel-gazing, looking in the mirror, and being anxious about their spiritual growth. Their self-acceptance through Christ without self-concern. That's so interesting. Self-acceptance without self-concern, is anchored in the acceptance of Jesus in their struggle to be faithful. They fasten their attention on God. Yeah. That's a wordy way, years, decades of life experience to phrase it.
Brendan Manning.
Right.
Oh, wait, only he can. Yeah.
Right. But I love that self-acceptance without self-concern is like, I'm rooted. I know my divine calling and I know what it's not.
Yeah.
And because of that, like, I'm just going to go after it. And then in the process of going after it, I know it's a struggle to be faithful, but I'm going to keep my eyes on Jesus and trust that,
So, that's so good. That's perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a graceful part of that in that it's okay to not have it all figured out. I think a lot of people are like, I don't know my divine calling and my life can't start until I figure it out.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, God wants to bring you on a journey to discover that divine calling, and He's got to teach you some things on that journey for you to truly accept what that calling is on your life.
Yep.
And so it's kind of just keep putting a foot forward.
Yeah.
Keep your eyes on Jesus and watch what God teaches you in the process. Well, Josh was just saying something as well that is, I think, really in line with what he said, and it was an advice given to him by another guy, and he just said that, like, oftentimes when you don't know what the right thing to do is or the path, if you're on the right path and stuff, just like focus on today doing the right thing in front of you and participating with God in the process, and then you'll kind of end up in that divine calling space that God wants you to be.
Right.
So, part of the thing that you talked about and you experience in your life and are experiencing, even getting phone calls from your plumber here, is like when we're trying to chase after our divine calling, we experience that limited time, we experience, ongoing opposition. Oftentimes it can just feel like we're in the weeds of life, right? Yeah. And so practically speaking, just what are the ways that we can get out of the weeds to remind ourselves of kind of the different aspects of this formula, specifically, divine calling though as well?
Yeah, it feels to me like there has to be, tell me if you see it any different, there has to be something that is repetitive, I think, on purpose, right? Like planned.
Scheduled, maybe.
Yeah, scheduled. Yeah, that gives you the opportunity to step back and look at a different scale, right? That just allows you to zoom out, because if you're living life like zoomed in, there has to be this moment where like you pull back to the big picture. And so I think about like in a relationship, or in marriage, for example, Em and I, we did this when we were dating and now married. So I think any kind of relationship it could happen. We have, a weekly meeting, and I know that, a lot of couples like have a similar rhythm of that, call it different things, but it's a time where it's like, it's not a date night. It's a moment where we check in, and there's repetitive things that we check in on in terms of like schedule and budget and different things that are like some more big picture things. That is more of a check like on the relationship, and how are you, and how is your heart, and what was it like on the other side of me, and how connected were we this week, and so on. And it's this moment of like, hey, I know we had like a really busy day, and I know we have some more things we have to do this evening, but like let's pause for this hour and do like a check-in on the relationship, and that allows us to zoom out a little bit in terms of like where we are and get out of the weeds for a moment. I think about like time with God, I think is like it's a daily way to do that, right? Like in terms of the faith category, there's this moment of like whatever is swirling around me, those moments early in the morning, to start my day, to reset my mind, reset my heart, to connect with my Father, like those kinds of moments provide an out of the weeds, type thing. I think any of the financial, it's not going to be like a weekly, and there might be a weekly checking of a budget or goals, but like, if you have more of like an annual or a semi, whatever, check in with an advisor, like those are some out of the weeds, where are we with our goals? Do we need to do any resets or check-ins or so on? I have a personal one that I don't even know that like I would advise to like all people or anything like that. But this came up like several years ago. This is like, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. We have ways that we evaluate like all of our systems in Northpoint. We have these like scorecards of what does it look like for this event or this environment or this Sunday experience to win. And let's be clear about it, so it's not just like gut feels. And I took that and I made a personal version of that to be like, this week looks like, I scored well, like relationally or in my marriage or, physically in my physical health or, faith wise, this is what it looks like to take some good steps over the course of a normal week. So I had like a weekly meeting with myself, basically. I had an hour where I checked in and kind of rated those things and looked at it over time. And it's kind of cool because when I look at it, like all the numbers trended in the right direction. Like all the numbers like increased because I had like, objective things in each category of what does this look like. And it was funny. I was telling you, like, I just picked that up again in the last couple of weeks because I had it all the way up to COVID. And then none of my things, when the world shut down in March of 2020, were consistent anymore. But now there's this time like kind of each week where it's like, okay, I'm going to pull back out of the craziness. And here's the big categories that matter in my life. Almost a little bit of what you were just talking about, like the bank account kind of idea. Yep. And how did I do with these areas that matter, this week? Or was I just like busy, tired, checked out, whatever it might be?
Yep.
So I think they're whatever that looks like. And I think what's helpful about like you versus me is like, you are like a, more systematic naturally, right? That's like more like your brain works and operates that way. Right. I'm a little bit more squirrel chaser, a little bit more like, get fired up and, chase this idea or whatever. So for me, that's definitely been like a discipline for me to have to incorporate some of those things. I'm not like, naturally going to go organized my whole life. Mm-hmm. And I think it's been like incredibly fruitful to put in like the time and energy into some of those areas to where I really am grateful for like each one of those kind of mechanisms now. So.
Yeah, for sure. As you were talking, it reminded me of a book called Essentialism by Mccowan, I think, is what is the author. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, that definitely is who wrote that book.
And he just talks about like, that very idea of essentialism, like leaning into what is most essential in your life, recognizing you can't do it all, but what's most important to you. And one of the things that he recommended that I've adopted and not executed well on, but I continue to try to, is doing like a quarterly offsite. So what he said, that's like a business term, right? But doing that one for you personally, where, once a quarter you take, every 3 months you take every, an hour, 2 hours, 3, or, if you have the time and margin, you take half a day and you go someplace you wouldn't normally go. And what you do is you just go through your life accounts. Like, so, when it comes to faithful or when it comes to marriage, when it comes to, parenting, all that stuff, work, like, how am I doing? Are there any pain points? Are there any things that I feel like I'm not addressing right now because I'm in the weeds? And that's a super helpful thing. When I do it, like, I feel like, man, I just walk away. Usually it's at a coffee shop or something, and I walk out going like, wow, I feel like I really recentered on something that like I'd been neglecting, or I just blink and 3 weeks goes by and I haven't thought about like taking Ashley on a date or something, stuff like that. That's really good. And then for me, one of the ones I have been good on, but mainly because our rhythm at Northpoint is we do Christmas Eve services, we take a Sunday off, and then the New Year starts. And so it's, in that time window where we're thinking about goals and New Year and stuff. So right. I will take one of those days because we usually have that week off, to rest up for the New Year. Yeah. I'll take one of those days and go to a coffee shop or go sit on a bench somewhere, and I will just go through my life accounts and update them, or like this past year, it was like adding Grayson, now I'm a dad. And so there's a parenting one that I have to go. And I had to like, what am I going to take away now? And I had to stomach that a little bit, recognizing just because I had a kid doesn't mean I had like a 9th and 10th account. Like, no, something's got to give, Right. And so that's humbling to take that recognition. And then to recognize, okay, now I've got a new set of priorities. And, getting out of the weeds helps you recognize your new set of priorities and new seasons of life. Yep. And to, let go of things that perhaps, just aren't important in a current season.
Yep.
So I'd recommend that too. Those are definitely much more type A. Like, some people might hear the idea of a quarterly offsite for, your personality and go like, oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. But like, we all want to, we all want the win in our sales throughout life. We all want to focus on what's most important. We all want to look back on our life and say we invested our time and energy into the most important things that were, significant in our lives. And this takes a little bit of us just, introspectively taking stock of where we're at certain times throughout our life to make sure we are investing our time and energy into those things. And so I just think it's one of the most helpful things, that you can do. And you can do it if you're not a follower of Christ and just do it. But I think when you add God and you spend like 30 minutes just open hands, God, what do you have for me this year? God, what are you trying to teach me right now? God, what are the things that I'm learning right now? That is also so helpful in that process too.
100%.
So I could talk about this stuff all day. I love it. I just absolutely love it. But we're wrapping up. Any last thoughts before we wrap up and head to part 4 of Winning Your Sales?
No, I think there's just a degree of in some of these really practical pieces there, and I could say this in any series, but just to do, some of these pieces that we're talking about, because I would genuinely desire that anybody, listening does experience, winning their sales. And I have all the confidence in the world that that's possible regardless of how much wind has been taken out, however dire circumstances are. And so that's a big heart behind the series. And so if there's any practical thing, if there is hey, 15 minutes, I'm going to try and paint the picture of the end of my life, and it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be a rough draft. You don't have to be a poet, but what does that look like? What's most important? I think there's some immediate effects to some of these things that really does start to put a little wind back in. So that's just what I would hope for people. Yeah. Progress, not perfection. 100%. Right? Yeah. So awesome. Well, cool. Well, Jordan, thank you for talking through some of this stuff. And I hope if you're listening, I know it's probably a fire hose of things you could go spend the next week trying to implement. And Jordan and I are not doing all of these things on our own. There's bits and pieces that are helpful for us. And so hopefully in the fire hose of info, you took something that you can do this week that's just new or practical, intentional, that's just going to add some wind in your sails. So that's our hope. That's our prayer for you. And we're going to be continuing the series this coming week in part 4. Buck will be back up, and so we be sure to be there either online or in person, and we'll see you there.